Um, I think 2020, I start going into this topic, nuclear weapons, for myself, and I find a workshop online, and all the people that was doing that workshop was from Lacey and Olympia, and I'm living in Olympia, so it was Glenn, Jim Manista, Joanne, and Mark Fleming. So
He's part of our OCAN group.
yeah, so after that, I just start going to the vigil with against nuclear weapon post, and I get involved in the OCAN, the coalition against nuclear weapons.
Can you explain a little bit about where you're from, and did that interest start from before, or is it?
No, always just from Chile, and I like the concept that Latin American because it's more universalist, not just one country. And that is another thing. It's just more country with same language and cultures kind of similar and more peaceful. And after that, I learned that it's a free zone of nuclear weapons, so have a sense for me. But now I'm living in this part of the world that is so dangerous and will affect to everyone actually the planet. So I'm being always I was anti-militaristic, but now it's just more specific about against nuclear weapons.
And Hardy, we were introducing ourselves. You might not know Michael. Michael is a lawyer. Last week he spoke about living in the Faroe Islands and helped share that experience. And he lives here in Panorama, and he's a neighbor of sorts here for me. But he shared a lot about his experiences living with solar energy and wind energy. Solar and wind.
It's wind and hydro and solar and tidal current. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Marilyn comes to us from Texas, and she's a very noteworthy Presbyterian and heads up our National Peace Fellowship, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. So, I mean, I think you know the rest of us.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
The correction, Joanne, I just convened the Peace Church Working Group, a very small task force. We have a wonderful person heading up the Peace Fellowship, Lori Leiter Bright.
Okay. Oh, I thought, okay. Well, I promoted you, I guess.
Yeah. You just should have said a few more words there.
Okay. Well, we're delighted that you joined us. I wanted to officially start and with would you allow a screen share?
It should be on, Joanne.
Yeah, good. Okay. Let's start with this one. Can you all see that?
Not at this time.
You can't see it. Okay. Oh, here. Well, slideshow from current slide. Oh, wait a second. I know what I did. I didn't write. How do I get the screen share?
There's a menu on the bottom of the screen, and you should have share screen as the third entry from the left.
Okay, let's do this. Share, there it is. Got it. Okay, now, thank you. Do from current slide. Now, can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to get us familiar with what actually happens when we have a nuclear explosion. And I have heard Ira Hofand, who's with the, he won Nobel Prize for being with the International Physicians for Physicians for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But he usually does a very good job of explaining exactly what happened. So I just wanted to remind us of what this was about. Now this happens to be a photo of Castle Bravo, but the mushroom cloud is, some people think it's a beautiful image, and in some ways it's colorful, but when you stop to think of what it does, it's not so beautiful. So let me remind you of that. In the first fraction of a millisecond, a flash of light superheats the air to 180 million degrees Fahrenheit. It's hotter than the sun, incinerating people, places, and things, absorbing a once bright, once powerful, once vibrant city center in a holocaust of fire and death. The fireball that you don't see here below, but it's below the clouds, below the mushroom cloud. The fireball strikes everything at ground zero with thousands of times more brilliant light than the sun at noon. Anyone staring at it, even if you're 50 miles away, gets blinded immediately. In milliseconds, the fireball expands in diameter, and its expansion depends on how many tons of TNT are in your bomb, whether it's a uranium bomb, hydrogen bomb, plutonium bomb, how big it is. So my numbers were for a 1 megaton bomb, but it would be much larger in larger bombs. But let me just, by comparison, help you to understand. In milliseconds, the fireball expands in diameter to more than 1 mile of pure fire. This is ground zero. The air around the fireball edges compresses into a steeply front-placed wave, which moves forward, mowing down everything and everyone in its path to 3 miles out in every direction. Accompanying this are winds several hundred miles per hour, 200, 300, even more. In ring 1, it is now a 9-mile diameter ring. Engineered structures change physical shape and most collapse. Now in Nagasaki and in Hiroshima, so many of the buildings were made of wood, that meant they were automatically evaporated, burned, incinerated. But the ones that were able to withstand some degree were the concrete ones. Piles of rubble left behind rise to 30 feet or more just in a matter of seconds. Everything is on fire, melting lead, steel, titanium. Paved streets turn into molten asphalt in seconds. Rare survivors, individuals, be they animals or humans, rare survivors become trapped in liquefied roadways, catch fire, and melt themselves. The X-ray light of the nuclear flash burns skin off human bodies, leaving their extremities a shredded horror of bloody tendons and exposed bones. You can actually see drawings of people with their skin dripping off them. The wind itself rips the skin off people's faces. Their eyeballs fall out and tears away limbs. Survivors die of shock, heart attack, and blood loss. And that's usually within a matter of minutes that this will happen. With tens of seconds from the detonation time, the fireball rises 3 miles up in the air. In this case, it was 4 miles wide for Castle Bravo. Some 1 to 2 million people are dead or dying, and this, of course, happens within seconds. Hundreds of thousands more are now caught in the rubble and the flames. Only foundations of buildings and the basements remain. And sometimes, if they do remain, there would be shadows of individuals that were there. The shadows, the individuals have totally disintegrated. For those beyond the inner ring, the radiation will reach them, and the radiation is the real killer for those who are not, burned to death, and eventually kill them. And that might be, depending on how close or far away, it's either going to be a death within a matter of hours, days, weeks, months, or years, sometimes decades. But the radiation is the biggest killer. The Japanese hibakusha are the survivors from a nuclear bomb. And I'm hoping that Yoshi will be able to join us because I do have a statement from her. But I actually took this reading from this book, which is one of the latest bestsellers. It's a nuclear war, a scenario, which really explains step by step by step by step what happens in a nuclear explosion. And it's absolutely horrifying. It's also an intriguing book. It's going to be made into soon it's going to be made into a movie, we're hoping. So that's where I borrowed a lot of the explanation that she uses here. But I also wanted to let you know that, and let me, I wanted to show you this book. The hibakusha are obviously the individuals who have experienced a nuclear blast and lived. And there was one individual that he became rather famous, at least when they were talking about someone who had a horrific experience. This was a young boy. I don't know if you can actually see this picture, but the picture insert right up here where you see the red, his picture, his complete back was burned and had these nodules on it that comes from the radiation. And so they never thought he would live, and he did. And he lived until he was 80 years old. And so this book was a story of his life, an atomic bomb on my back. He had, I don't know how many surgeries. I think it was at least 25. I haven't read the book yet. But the hibakusha have been the ones who have told us what it was like to be able to live through these things. Most of the ones who are alive now, obviously, were children when this happened because most of them are in their 90s now. But they're still talking. And the most beautiful part that I remember hearing about was that they were shunned by the rest of the Japanese because they were oftentimes disfigured. They had serious after effects, and so they were not marriageable. Usually they lost their fertility aptitude, so they were not good candidates for marriage. And so that was one issue that was very, very real for them. And anyway, I wanted to start there. Does anybody here have any experience? And we'd like to welcome Kim. Kim, you want to can we see your face?
Sorry, Aunt Joanne, I'm under the weather.
Oh, okay. Ooh,
It's okay. It's okay. I'm listening. I'm listening in.
okay. Kim is Tommy's wife, and Tommy and Kim is my niece-in-law. She was my husband's niece, and she lives in Louisiana. And Kim, you want to introduce yourself briefly? We have two new people here who haven't met you. Do you feel okay to do that?
Hi, I'm Kim DeBrock. I'm from New Orleans and just so intrigued about everything. And Joanna just opened my eyes to get so informed about the nuclear weapons. So I'm here to listen and learn.
And Tommy is the gentleman, her husband is the one that I mentioned before, had an oil business. So is he going to be able to join us or no?
Soon he goes to his mom and dad's house every afternoon at 5. So I'm waiting for him to come back.
Okay, okay. We'll get to meet him later. Okay, wonderful. I don't know if Yoshi is there anyone here who had any kind of personal experience in one way or another with a bomb. Well, thank goodness. And I applaud you all for joining us, because this is such a hard topic to talk about. And so, and the fact that you didn't have personal experiences, thank God. What I wanted to share with you is a statement that that Yoshi had prepared, and I think she's feeling a little timid about coming on board, but I wanted to share that with you. Okay, let's see. Stop share this. Let's try this again. Share. This one. Okay. Now Yoshi, I don't know where in Japan she was living, but because she's a member of Westminster Church, I had asked her if she could talk to us as a person who's Japanese, right? And be able to tell us what she thought and what experiences she had growing up in Japan. She's lived here in this country for 40 years. And so she probably had about, I don't know, I think she's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50s or 60s. So she had a chunk of time growing up. But this is what she had written about her comments. So I will allow me to read them for her, and then she can elaborate if she said that she's okay with sharing this. So it's the awareness of citizens of Japan regarding the nuclear weapon and nuclear power plants as a threat to world peace and global survival. I was asking her, what is she, how do the Japanese feel about the topic of nuclear weapons? So she checked the information on matters from the websites of, let's see if I can have this. Okay, from the websites of both Hiroshima City and Nagasaki City, and there are a variety of activities which are conducted by those cities. And let me know if you see her coming on, because she should be reading this if not. And they are activities that the Japanese government actually sponsors, and other organizations sponsor the information that is shared within the Japanese community about nuclear weapons. Incidentally, the current premier of Japan was interested in actually developing nuclear weapons. So there's been a turnaround in some thinking and currently political thinking. One of the good examples that she found, though, was the match to Hiwa of Hiroshima City. I don't know what that is. I hope she would be able to explain that. And then there was promotion of information about nuclear weapons extinction. Some of that has led to a sense of a consciousness about peace and a succession in harmony. A succession of issues surrounding the bomb and the harm that they have caused and other experiences. When I had asked her some questions about the awareness of ordinary people who were directed by the bombs, she said most people really did not have any contact. In other words, the majority of people outside of the cities that were affected really did not have any contact at all with the bomb or with the Bakusha. But as I mentioned before, there was a discrimination that you read about over the course of their lives. They were really not accepted. They had a very difficult time. And you'll hear this when you hear the Hibakusha talk. So her answer is that they are not quite aware of the sufferings of the affected people and the threatening facts about nuclear weapons and nuclear powers in their lives. Though I could remember hearing a teacher at one of the schools in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, that was bombed. And what they have is they have field trips by students from all over the country coming in and visiting. And all the students are prompted to actually explain to these students coming in what it was like being in Nagasaki. So there is energy coming out of the residents of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki to share, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's curriculum across the board in every school. Though they do have schools visiting yearly. The only obvious time when you're hearing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the bombing are on August 6th and August 9th, when there are memorial services that go on within the country. And it's broadcast by the various media, and that is considered big news. So that's when they actually talk about what actually happened and remind people. And then if there are some incidents happening relating to nuclear power, like the meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear plant, of course, there's a lot of attention to that. And accordingly, Japanese people are reminded at times like that of its threat and become conscious of world peace for the time being. Does that extend into advocacy on behalf of nuclear weapons? Probably not. Does that extend to them supporting the treaty? No. There are only 2 cities in Japan have supported the treaty, and you can guess which 2 they are, but that's all. So it's not like it's an issue of high interest on the Japanese networks. I believe that there are many organizations which are focusing on the movements of promoting world peace, including disarmament, abolition of the nuclear power plants and such. So this gives you a slight introduction to someone who is Japanese. And of course, she is obviously interested in learning more about this issue, and was feeling a little bit uncomfortable with being here because, I don't know, for some reason she was feeling timid about talking, though she's a delightful woman. So maybe she will join us, I don't know. And in the meantime, we want to welcome Peter back. We see that he's with us, and we'll stop the share on this. I don't know if anybody has any observations themselves or associations with the Japanese. Has anybody here visited either Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Okay, I had a chance to, I went on a Fulbright-like experience in Japan, and when they gave us free time, 2 of us out of our group of 18 decided that we were going to go to Hiroshima. And when you go to Hiroshima and you see the museum, Hiroshima is a lively, lively city. You know, it's all rebuilt, obviously. And it's very lively, very enthusiastic about things. But of course, when the memorial comes, they do the floating of the lanterns, just like they float lanterns up in Green Lake, up in Seattle on every August 9th. I don't know if you've ever gone to those lantern floating experiences, but they are incredibly beautiful. And they do that in front of the Hiroshima Museum on a regular basis. And most likely there's a Nagasaki Museum too. And I think they have a pond around there where they float the lanterns. But it is a very, when you begin to read the details about what life was like, and you know, they experienced all those horrible things that I wrote about. You know, they just had blocks of cement where you have the shadow of a body. They even have that as an exhibit in the United Nations. So it's something that's, you know, that's obviously very real, and but we wish that there were a little bit more advocacy, I guess, coming from Japan to be able to help people understand that. In our situation, we've had 2 of the Catholic archbishops that have gone to Japan, and they have met with the archbishops of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The Pope has taken himself to both, you know, the Catholics, at least that part of the Catholic hierarchy, but there are only 2 American bishops that have taken on that as a topic. So we can kind of move on from there and be able to start to talk about the book. So what I would love to hear you say is what about this whole issue of nuclear weapons as where do you stand on it? What did you get out of this reading, and what do you think is important? Anybody want to start?
In the construction of this book, chapters 1 through 6 deal with the climate catastrophe and tries to show to everyone that it's pretty obvious and it's growing and it will come to be, although it'll come to be somewhat slower than a blast from a bomb. The chapters that we had for today wanted to tell us that there's an alternate disaster waiting in the wings, and that's the threat of nuclear weapons, which have not been used, paradoxically, because there's often been the atmosphere of hatred and so forth that would want to drop weapons like that. Their development, however big the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were, I believe Hiroshima is rated at 20 kilotons, which a kiloton is simply 1,000 tons. So that's of TNT blowing up in one spot. So if you had 20 times that, you'd have a pretty big explosion. The weapons, or the wounds from nuclear weapons are not radically different from the wounds from regular bombs. Our smaller bombs are doing as much damage in Gaza when they're dropped on human flesh. The only part we don't do is irradiate them. But everything else, the high temperatures, the blinding flash, they're all there. It's part of a bomb. What we did after the war in that blessed time when we were the only people who had the bomb, instead of our realizing what a strange device this was and not wanting to give it up to other countries or other controls, we kept it ourselves and we improved on it. And I can improve on something hateful, you can imagine. So you make them bigger explosions from smaller bombs, which are easier to lob into space or carry in a bomber. And that's what we did. Along the way, one of the physicists reminded us that, well, this atomic bomb thing is really, it's just the beginning of explosions. Because you could find that another atomic process called fusion, which takes place in the sun under high pressure, where hydrogen joins together in a group and forms a helium atom, also releases huge amounts of energy. So they didn't take too long to develop the hydrogen bomb once the Soviets had nuclear weapons. But thank God we didn't drop them anywhere. I can't think of any targets in the remainder of Europe or Russia that would have been suitable for such a weapon. Not that Nagasaki or Hiroshima was suitable for a weapon, except that you were going to kill a lot of people. In case you had forgotten how terrible these are, these few chapters in this section was going to remind you, or possibly introduce you, to how bad these weapons can be. They are beyond our imagination. And they were beyond our imagination when we were testing them, and we spread huge amounts of radioactivity everywhere. But we don't have that image playing before us now as lively as we have planets exploding. Oh yeah, science fiction can make something bigger than a hydrogen bomb. Let's Let's follow Star Trek and see how many worlds they destroy. So most of the people around have not had the kind of experience with these weapons that we've had. We grew up under the threat, the growing threat, the nothing you can do about the threat, and watched the situation worsen in the time we were there. The young kids today, when asked about catastrophes, will name the climate catastrophe. And you have to almost have to talk them into the fact that nuclear weapons can do as much or more damage much faster, but they don't have the imagination of reality about nuclear weapons. We have been to museums and walked along the sides of a B-52 and can imagine what kind of flight that was. We've been in Florida and watched rockets take off and know how they're improved, how they can get to where they're going to go pretty accurately. So the situation about weapons has not gone away at all with the demise of the Soviet Union. We still have Russia, which has a lot of bombs. China is making more and more bombs. And of course, we have a glut of bombs, which is only right. I mean, we started it off, right? So that's the bad dream. That's the nightmare of which people nowadays, the average Joe, the Joe Sixpack, as they call him, might not be as alive to, even though there have been threats of use of weapons very much in these days. Mr. Putin has not forgotten he has weapons, and possibly that's why their talk about them has resumed. For the most part, I think our government was very, very happy not to be talking about them at all and letting the smoke, clear. Mr. Obama, however, did one terrible thing. He committed us to a whole generation of modernization of these weapons. So we're in the thick of it again. Maybe that's why there's so much interest.
And I thank you, Jim. I wanted to say that I got into this because I had a mentor who helped a minister a Unitarian minister organize a special session on disarmament. And that was back in the 80s. And so it ultimately led to a million person march in New York at the United Nations when they were holding a special session. I took part. I mean, that was a big deal. And, there are a lot of people from New York were there, but they were there from all over. They had hundreds of people from Japan that came for that march. And so when I found out about this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, that really got me. That just woke up those memories of the 80s, and I got smitten by that treaty. How many people are familiar with the treaty? In other words, did you know about this treaty before you read the book? And I'm questioning Michael and Peter, because I know the OCAN folks, they know about the treaty. But was this something new to you, or were you familiar with it?
I knew about it, but didn't know the details.
Okay, and Peter?
That was Peter.
Oh, that was you. Okay. I couldn't tell sometimes your mouth is below the screen, so
Yeah.
okay. What do you think of the treaty? What was your response to the treaty?
Better than nothing, but still not enough.
Okay. And Michael, what was your familiarity with it? Could you share that?
I didn't have any familiarity with it, so I'm kind of new to all this.
Okay.
Well, there are a
Well-
couple things you might want to know. It didn't come out of nowhere.
Mhm.
It has a history. Joanne, you want to tell them about the Treaty for the Non-Proliferation
Sure.
of
Yeah,
Weapons,
he
and
wrote-
especially Article 6.
Yeah, he wrote about one of the most one of the treaties that seem to have worked. I provided you when on this kind of cheat sheet of all the topics that were in the reading. I provided you a list of dates, which countries came on board and at which time they came on board. By the time we got to the end of the 60s, we already had 5 countries that had the weapons. And people were afraid that that might escalate. And so those who had the weapons realized that they had power having the weapons, but they weren't that anxious about more countries coming on board. So there was some kind of movement to do something to maybe stop it. So they came up with the term non-proliferation, which means, okay, we have the weapons and we will promise to protect any areas that are under our domain. And of course, that was a Cold War, so we did have, Russian allies and Western allies. But the rest of the countries shouldn't go down that road. We'll take care of you, right? And that was a treaty that was signed by 190 countries. So they kind of bought into that. But there was an Article 6 in there, and in the Article 6, it said, this is a really nice idea that you don't want to proliferate, but really, none of us really like these weapons. They're expensive, and so Article 6 said those countries that have the weapons are now morally bound to get rid of them. And so when you signed on to the treaty and you were a nuclear weapon state, that was your commitment that you were going to get rid of them. Well, every 5 years, they would have meetings of the members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to examine, well, what's going on. Well, over the course of years, there was a huge escalation. We went up to about 80,000 weapons in the world. And then there was this turnaround, and it was a de-escalation. And so now we're down to about 15,000. And so every 5 years there was news. Is a new treaty coming on board? Are you getting more weapons? Are people checking to see that how many you have, et cetera? But by 2010, the countries that didn't have the weapons were getting tired of being bullied, because obviously the nuclear powers were bullies. And it was okay for them to have weapons, and they would kind of flaunt them every so often, but they weren't allowed to have them. So kind of they rose up at one of these meetings and say, hey guys, when in Thai Nation are you going to get rid of your weapons? That's what you signed in Article 6. And so that became an opportunity for the peace people. And they brought those countries together, the 40 countries together, that said, hey guys, when? It's been 50 years now and you haven't done a thing. You brought your arsenals down, but we still have these weapons. When are you going to eliminate them? Because that's what the Article 6 was saying, right? So they started to meet. And the group that was organizing this was the International Committee to International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And they would meet with the 40 countries and they would bring in speakers. And my favorite speaker was the head of the Red Cross, because I was a Red Cross volunteer, and he was the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he would say, let's look at the humanitarian results. And he would read what I would just read you about. This is what those bombs do. This is what we're actually talking about. This is the human impact that it has, the obliteration of a city like that, against the laws of war, which is you're not supposed to aim at civilians. Well, how can you have a nuclear bomb and not involve civilians, right? So the 40 became 50, became 60, became 122. and 122 nations said, you know, we should have a treaty to outlaw nuclear weapons. Nobody thought of that possibility except these OCAN guys. They landed up winning the Nobel Prize in 2017. The treaty opened for signature, and we now have 93 countries that have signed it. Now, do you know what signing and ratifying means? Are you familiar with those terms? Okay, let me clarify that. Now, this is international law, right? A treaty like that is not made up. I mean, you can have a treaty between two countries. But then you're going to have a treaty that is made under the auspices of the UN, and this one was made under the auspices of the UN, where you yourself did not write the treaty. A group of people, in this case, it was under the aegis of the ambassador from Costa Rica, she helped write the treaty. And she had other ambassadors that helped her. But it wasn't a single country's contribution. It was a network of countries. So within the UN, what you could do is, well, this is kind of interesting. You know, I kind of go along with this idea. I don't like the idea of nuclear weapons. And those were the voices of the countries that didn't have them, because they knew how much money was going into them, and they wished they would get some foreign aid instead, you know, or have something more positive that was going on with those. So they decided to, on the idea of a treaty, and the treaty passed with a vote of 122 countries. And then the countries that were interested to bring that treaty back to their own country and have their own country examine, do we want to ratify this treaty? Ratify means enforce. Do we want to ratify the treaty? So of the 93 nations that have signed the treaty, 70 have ratified it. Now, what does ratification mean? It means that you bring that treaty into your own legal system and you enforce it. So what's the big deal about that? The big deal is what the treaty says. It turns out that Ambassador Gomez, the woman who wrote the treaty, was a sharp one. And she looked at a treaty that had just been ratified, and lo and behold, it was a treaty on chemical weapons. And lo and behold, it got passed by over 120 countries, and it got not only ratified, it really worked. They were getting rid of chemical weapons. Something really worked with weapons of mass destruction. And she said, why did it work? They had so many verbs that they put into the treaty, every single aspect of the treaty of nuclear weapons contact, whether it be research, whether it be development of the uranium, whether it be the transportation of whether it be selling the treaty, selling the widgets to the corporations, no matter what process was involved was going to be outlawed. So if a country signed on to this treaty, they're now obligated to do all these different issues. And that's what happened with the chemical weapons. And it got so that the companies that were producing chemical weapons were meeting such negative publicity, they decided it's not worth it. You know, we're going to stop making these doggone weapons. People aren't buying them. They're boycotting the weapons. They don't want them because they now are illegal. And some of the boards were saying, we're not going to use them because they're illegal. So that's the process that has gone on. So what do you guys think about that? The whole idea of maybe, I mean, the whole goal is to get, well, first of all, the treaty was written with the idea that this was going to be the voices of those countries that didn't want the weapons. They were all the countries, most of the countries that didn't have them. They don't want them. There are a few that did, but most of them didn't want them. Okay? So that was the idea, that you're giving voice to the non-nuclear powers. So they wrote the treaty in such a way that it could be acceptable to those countries. And sure enough, it was. Because the 73 countries that have ratified the treaty say this is fine with us. We don't have them. We don't want them. And the issue is, what about the 9 countries that have them? Oh, no, we're saving the world, guys. Oh, no, this is all important. Okay, so that's where we are. Now,
Joanne,
he
I'd like to,
proposes,
Joanne, I'd like to make a couple clarifications,
go ahead.
especially on the word treaty. Treaty is not a law. It's an agreement between two countries
Contract.
to be two nations to behave a certain way. And as a result, that agreement does not necessarily bind any of the other nations who didn't sign on. Like, for instance, we had treaties with the Native Americans, and that's one nation with another nation. The United Nations passes no laws. They may have a Congress in that they have a General Assembly, but when they get together and vote on
Resolutions of the
something,
United Nations. No, I'm sorry. Resolutions of the United Nations are international law. When you ask what is international law, it's the resolutions that the UN passes. They're the arbiter of international law. Okay? Sorry, I say that as an NGO.
that's okay. I was going to make the point that whatever they pass, they don't call them laws. They call them resolutions, and everybody's supposed to abide. But a lot of people don't, and sometimes they have to get involved in a fuss before they actually agree to keep the treaties they make. The 100 and some countries who have adopted the Treaty for Non-Proliferation are basically saying, we're taking a moral stance to the other countries. We're saying, these are terrible. They should never be used. No one should drop a weapon like this on 1 million people, or 10 million people, or even 1,000 people. So they are witnessing against the 9 countries who are still battling out. If only they would understand what the world is saying to them, and seeing that they are wrong, and that they might keep producing weapons or modernizing them or anything of that sort, they're committing themselves to an immoral act of war, whether that is against standing law or not. I hope I just clarified it. And sorry about the laws and resolutions there.
Okay, I wanted to bring up, are there any questions so far about what the treaty is about?
I just want to emphasize that the treaty is one way to declare and take action that nuclear weapons are illegal, and the treaty does do that. And there's also resolutions, HRes 77 in our Congress right now to support the treaty. But that's not the only way to disarm or to renege or renounce nuclear weapons. Costa Rica did lead that effort about the treaty, you're right. Kazakhstan, when it became a country at the dissolution of the USSR, had nuclear weapons on its territory that were previously belonged to the USSR, and said, we're not interested, and said, we are getting rid of these. There are people who can actually make decisions like that.
South Africa did the same thing. South Africa went down the road of saying, we want to make a weapon. I don't know if it got so far as finishing the production of that weapon, but it decided we don't want this anymore. And they unmade the weapon. Okay. Brazil did the same thing. Brazil was on the path to create nuclear weapons and did an about face. So there have been examples of countries that that did exactly what the treaty wanted them to do, but this was before the treaty, and they did it themselves. They just decided, for example, Mandela decided once he was, in South Africa, he said, no, this is much too expensive. This is ridiculous. And so he's leading a study group as to, now South Africa is leading a study group to help countries that have the weapon to dismantle it, go through the process of dismantling it. So all those steps have been actually defined for any of the countries that hopefully will follow that process. That's going on right now. So that's the exciting part. Now, Tim and Wallace proposes, so we've got this, this resistance, people aren't talking about nuclear weapons, and our president wasn't doing anything about nuclear weapons, except all the 9 powers came out with a statement at the beginning of last year. Oh, no, we're not going to use the weapons. We're just keeping the world safe because we're just keeping them. Well, why do you have them, and why are you making them? Why are you modernizing them? And so he proposes in chapter 10 a rather simple move. Do you remember what that was? Does anybody remember what his move was? I actually on the sheet put it in green because I wanted you to.
I believe he calls his program GRIT. But I don't remember what GRIT stands for. If anybody else wants to help me.
Well, what he's proposing is very simple. He thinks that the President of the United States, as an initiative, should sign the treaty. Sign it. Sign it means we express interest in the treaty. You didn't ratify it, you're not enforcing it, you're signing it. So what difference would that make? Well, if you sign it as the president, you are telling all the departments, hold it, this is the road that we're on. We're now on the road to consider dismantling our nuclear weapons. Well, what does that mean? Well, as a presidential order, Congress cannot authorize any new weapons. We're on this road, guys. I signed it, and you haven't ratified it yet, so we're not dismantling it yet. When you ratify it, you have to dismantle the weapons. But we're talking about that. We're showing the world that we're considering excited about the idea that if the president signs it, and if it's going to be President Kamala Harris, then that would be ideal, because I doubt that President Trump would sign it, but you never know. They're very expensive weapons, very, very expensive weapons. And we have a lot of debt, and we could transfer that money to things like solar energy. Okay, so that's his big move. Now, did you ever hear, some of you might have heard of Back from the Brink, which is an effort that Tim Wallace doesn't agree with, but it seems to have a lot of favor with the people in the larger nuclear community. Does anybody who has heard of it want to explain what it is?
Well, why doesn't he agree with it?
Well, he says they're baby steps. If you say no first use, that's fine. But if somebody else uses it, what's okay to do? It's okay to use them back. So you're not eliminating them. You're just saying, don't use them. You can have them, you can polish them, you can, update them, you can do whatever you want. Just don't use it first. Well, that's not solving the problem.
So that clause assumes that they'll still exist, then.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, because you're not saying no use. I mean, really, if you're abolishing them, you're saying no, don't use them. Okay, so what about taking the authority away from the president? Because now any head of state of the nuclear weapon powers is the individual that has the power to authorize the use of that weapon. So in our case, it is the president and the president only. Okay, and it has to be that person. Okay, and of course, in this book, when Annie Jacobson is telling that story, she has interesting things to talk about what happens when a nuclear bomb goes off and the president has to decide what to do. And she has a very interesting take on that. All right, it has to be the president. All right. So if it's not going to be the president, then what does Back from the Brink say? Well, the Congress can decide when to detonate a weapon. Well, are you taking the weapons away? No, you're not taking them away. You're just transferring the decision as if it's going to be easier for the Congress to make a decision like that. I don't think our Congress would, they could go on for years, which maybe would be good about whether to detonate a weapon. But you're not solving the problem. Okay. What about hair trigger alert? Well, hair trigger alert, that means that if you find out that someone has sent a weapon over to you, you are ready to retaliate. And you can retaliate within 12 minutes. And you must decide within 12 minutes whether or not you're going to retaliate, especially if those weapons are headed your way. Well, now, does that solve the problem of nuclear weapons?
No, those basic points assume nuclear weapons still exist.
Exactly, for each one of the Back from the Brink pieces. And that's why he said they're baby steps and they're not solving the problem. And he comes down really hard on that issue. And now Back from the Brink will get 70 supporters in Congress that think that that's a great idea. Because, you got some piece of the action in your home state or your home district, and there's somebody who's doing something for the nuclear weapons, and it might be a loss of jobs, and the military lobbies you like crazy because they have the making of nuclear weapons is distributed through every single congressional district in this country. Every single district has a piece of the action. And that means jobs. Now, Marilyn Strickland has a piece of the action. Oh, well, we happen to have Bangor in our district. Well, that's just a few jobs in Fort Lewis, McCord, and Bangor. That's just a few jobs here. Well, geez. Okay, so he comes down really strong with this idea that if the president decides, when he goes through all the different treaties, what they find out is with some of the treaties, if one side says we'll stop doing X, Y, or Z, and there's enough trust, soon the other side will say, okay, we'll stop too. Okay, and that's happened several times. And it worked. Especially with nuclear weapons, it worked. That you just have the one side to take the courage. And they have this whole thing about Kennedy. Kennedy came out with an absolutely gorgeous statement when he spoke before the American University of June of 1963. And he had already negotiated with Gorbachev over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they didn't have a nuclear war. They talked to each other and stopped it. Kennedy went on when he spoke at American University to say, let's get rid of all our weapons. Let's get rid of these guys. Now, what happened to Kennedy? And there is that theory that the powers that be, because as soon as Kennedy died, whoppo, back to escalation of the weapons. Build more weapons, and Kennedy was stopping that. I never knew that information, but that I've heard scholars now say that there is. I mean, it's just happenstance that days, weeks after Kennedy died, there was legislation introduced on expanding nuclear arsenal by coincidence. So anyway, what do you think that would work? That if the president might sign, that it would be an open door to maybe Russia signing on? Because we have had treaties with Russia. The START treaty worked. It worked. Each side got rid of 1,500 weapons. because they allowed each other to visit their arsenals, to make surprise visits to their arsenals, and to report on when they were dismantling, and they actually agreed. They agreed, and they had verification, and those weapons were destroyed on each side. Well, that sounds like good news. It can happen. It really can happen. But if we don't have enough people knowing that or supporting that, we're not going to go anywhere. I mean, this is an issue which is a dead issue in most people's minds. That's why I applaud the fact that you're with us today, because you're willing to even think about it and talk about it some more.
Now, did you say that was Kennedy and Gorbachev? I thought it was Reagan and Gorbachev, no?
No, I mean Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Reagan and Gorbachev, yeah.
You know, all those Russian leaders look alike.
They all sound the same.
Boys and girls, it looks like we've exhausted all the capacity for compassion in this 60 minutes. And we're looking forward to next week.
Yeah, next week, Tim and Wallace is going to be with us. You're going to meet the author. And so what I would ask you to do, because that whole last section also gets complicated, but could you come with your own questions? Even please explain what you're talking about when you're saying this. I mean, we really want to, he can come, and I've heard him, and he can give you a slideshow if you want. Do you want that, or do you want time to ask questions of him, or both? I've seen his slideshows. He compresses this into, like, he compresses the whole book into a 30-minute slideshow or something.
I would love to see a slideshow.
Okay. Yeah.
That's
He'll
true, but
take
it won't be,
slides from, if you
it won't be
look
much.
at
Will we have time for that?
well, yeah, I mean, we have an hour, so if we start early and we won't do introductions we'll start at 5 o'clock, and we'll ask Timon to be here at 5 o'clock and ask him to present, and he can readily do yeah. I mean, I've seen him do that. He did that for the Washington State group. You know, he's done it several times, and he does a good job. I mean, he's very professional. Okay, well, thank you, guys. You allowed me to talk a lot, but I hope this was helpful, and I hope you.
Yes, you're a wealth of information, Aunt Joanne.
Well, I got started on this, and it just kind of, I don't know. The more you get into it, I have to say that I actually finished this book yesterday. This is an incredibly fearsome book. She actually explains, Timon doesn't like the fact that she used a scenario of North Korea bombing the United States. And she said, oh boy, you're reinforcing that old stereotype there, they're going to do it. And that's what she writes about. But when she writes about that, she takes you step by step by step by step to, and I'll tell you, the end is not the good end. And she'll take you step by step by step by step towards the end of the world in 72 minutes. And it's frightening, and yet you can't put it down, because she connects all these little pieces. And she interviewed, in the beginning of the book, she didn't interview any of the peace folks, not one. But she did interview pages here. Look at this. These are the interviews, right? She has 3 pages of interviews, and they're all the professionals in the field, the generals and the corporate makers and the people who were the bases and the commanders. I mean, a whole bunch of them. But they're all.
Well, we said it was terrible, and she proves it. So
Yeah, she does. She does.
okey-doke.
But I mean, if you really want to, honest to God, you read it and it's horrible reading, and you can't put it down, because she kind of draws you into it. So, and it's a bestseller now. It's up, it made the New York Times bestseller list. And
Have a
so
good week. We hope to see you again on Sunday. Take good
Yeah,
care.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank
you.
y'all very much.
See you
Okay,
next week.
bye-bye.
See you next
Bye.
week.